Yes, I bought this AI generated weaving book so that you don't have to. Hi weaving friends, if you are brand new here, because I kind of forget, I always feel like we all know each other here, right? But if you're seeing this video and it's the first video of mine that you've ever seen, my name is Kelly. I'm a weaver and I also teach weaving online, and I have an online weaving school and I sell my digital download patterns and I do a bunch of other things around weaving. I also have a YouTube members channel called Kindred Weavers, which you can join with a link down below. And of course, anything I talk about today will have links down in the description box. I'm also holding my mic today because of what I'm wearing. I tried to attach the mic and it was just dragging my shirt down in an inappropriate manner. So it's holding the mic today. Okay, so if you know me already, you know that I am a really big fan of books in general, and I have quite a collection of weaving books. And really, as weavers, we are so blessed because there are just so many good weaving books out there. Quite a few people have said to me over the years, why don't you write a book on weaving? And I'm like, well, because number one, it's a lot of work. And number two, there are just so many good books out there already. I'm not really sure that I would have anything really valuable to add. I don't know. I'll never say never, but there are just so many good books for us to choose from already. So I was on Amazon, cruising around and browsing for any new weaving books that I might have missed that are either coming out or have already come out, because you can often pre-order. And I came across some that looked a little bit odd and that I haven't seen before. Now, as soon as I clicked into one of these books, I realized what it was that seemed odd about it. They all screamed AI. Now, do I have a problem with AI in general? I do not. This is not really a discussion about whether AI is a good thing or a bad thing, but I want everyone who is learning weaving, if you are investing, whether it's in your yarn, your equipment, your learning materials, I want to recommend what is going to be the best for you, what's going to give you the most value for your money, because who wants to waste money on materials that are not quite up to scratch? So I perused around these AI books a little bit, had a look at their covers and their descriptions and that kind of thing on Amazon, and I ended up purchasing one not because I wanted to contribute to the problem, but the opposite. I don't want any of you to be roped in. So afterwards, I'm going to talk about the signs to look out for so that you know when you see an AI generated book. And I'm going to also recommend some books that I think are really good by genuine, real people. So here is the issue with a book that is completely generated by AI. Okay, so the first point is I can almost guarantee a weaver did not write that book. It's someone who has used AI, ChatGPT or whatever else they are using, to completely write the book, including the images, including the layout, every single thing for them. So what is the problem with that? Well, there are certainly some ethical issues around using AI. But if you are buying a book that is not written by someone who is actually somewhat proficient in weaving or even has looked at a weaving loom, then that's a real issue, wouldn't you agree? So look, AI has gotten really, really good at laying things out, explaining things in a way that is like, I would almost describe it as charismatic, like comes across really well. So you're reading it and you're like, oh, yeah, this is really encouraging and all of that. But it's missing, even as much as it tries, it's missing the human touch. And look, especially with something like weaving that is so hands-on. You know, you could spend a couple of years reading books and learning about weaving that way. But until you get your hands on a loom or some yarn or whatever tool you're going to be using for weaving, are you really going to understand it properly? Because something happens to your brain when you do things with your hands, right? You come to an understanding of what you're doing that is completely different from standing back and learning about it from that aspect. I guess it's kind of like I have a bit of a problem with the way that universities do things like nursing degrees, because in the old days, the olden days, as we call them now, very long ago, like when my mother-in-law was a nurse, my mother-in-law, who is in her 90s, they did all of their training on the job. I'm not saying that was the absolute best scenario, that it can be mixed. There could be a mix of theory and on-the-job training. But I think that the nurses of that generation were so much better prepared for what they needed to do day to day. And even though the way university degrees are run, at least here in Australia, is if you're training to be a nurse, studying to be a nurse, you'll go out and you'll do practical stints for a certain amount of time and all of that. That's all part of your degree. But I guess it's the difference between going to university and sitting in lecture halls, which I've done, and so I can personally attest to how useless that was for me, to someone being like an apprentice and actually doing things on the job. I had our farrier here yesterday to do our horse's shoes. She's got shoes and she needs her feet cared for and all of that. And each time the farrier comes, he has an apprentice with him, and each time I see the apprentice has skilled up a little bit more, leveled up a little bit more. And that's because he's doing it. He's getting the understanding of, what does a good healthy foot feel like? How do I rasp this hoof properly? How do I put on a pair of shoes? Just all of the practical stuff. So I've gone on a complete tangent there, sorry. I tend to do this. But there are so many good life analogies, right, for anything that you're talking about. So anywho, let's get back to the problem with AI writing a book about weaving. It's not a person. There are no physical hands involved. There is no physical brain involved. There's no creativity that, like I said, it comes across really well. But once you start delving in a little bit, you see how much it's lacking. Okay, so let's talk about this book in particular, because it's the one that I ended up purchasing. I didn't read the whole thing cover to cover because admittedly it was very long, but I did read the whole first section and then I skimmed the rest of it. What I was particularly interested to know about and to look at was the project section. Most important, really, for a book, because if you have someone who has a weaving book and they're a beginner and you're giving them projects to weave, really, really important that they succeed. So there's another issue. If you have the wrong instructions, the wrong way of coming across, misinformation, that could turn somebody off weaving. They could try that and go, oh, this isn't for me. My project did not turn out well. And that's a real shame. The first section of the book is a sample, and I actually really like the way that it's presented, because it's like, well, we have all these projects later in the book, but if you just can't wait and your loom's been sitting there and you're just desperate to get something on it, which a lot of people are, of course, then it shows you how to do a quick warp. The book claims to be step-by-step and for beginners. After reading the first section, I was like, I would never give this to a beginner. There are so many steps that are just skipped in the apparently step-by-step instructions. Some of the terminology is incorrect, naming the parts of the loom and naming them the wrong things, or having the names in the wrong sections on the diagram, things like that, just so confusing. And overall, it's just too little information for a beginner. An absolute beginner in anything needs everything laid out for them. And if you're going to call yourself step by step, you better provide step by step. And this doesn't. An example is it doesn't mention like the heddle size. It says to use a worsted yarn, but it doesn't say anything about heddle size. How important is that? That is too important a step to skip. So you might get someone who uses a worsted yarn with, I don't know, a 10-dent heddle, a 12-dent heddle, and they're like, I cannot weave this. It's way too stiff. Or my yarn's shedding so much that my warp threads keep breaking. These, to a seasoned weaver, are obvious problems of using the wrong size heddle for the yarn that you have. So kind of a crucial step. Also in this beginner step-by-step section to get your loom up and running, it talks about how you're warping and measuring your warp and everything, but doesn't actually talk about a direct warping peg. Like, I got it that they were talking about direct warping because I'm an experienced weaver. But if I was brand new, I'd be like, what? How am I actually doing this? Like, it's saying to measure out the warp and put the loops around the measuring the way you measure or something like that. It was really unclear. There was no mention of a peg at all in that section. Then there are little like editorial errors, like a little section where it's got text of saying how there should be an image here of blah, blah, blah. But there's no image there. There's just the text saying there should be this here. That's like an editorial thing. So that's a big oversight, that kind of thing. That just lacks professionalism. And I am not saying, you know, I write ebooks, I write my own patterns. I do all my own editing for the most part. Sometimes I get one of my daughters to read over something to make sure that it makes sense. But for the most part, I'm doing my own editing. And I make mistakes sometimes. And people will, after they've purchased the pattern or the ebook, they'll say, oh, I'm not sure about this bit, or it seems like you've got a typo here or something like that. And so then I'm able to fix it. So I'm not saying that I'm perfect in any way. But, you know, there are some editorial things that should really be picked up. Like, it makes you wonder, if you see something like that, did this person who used AI to generate this ebook, did they even read over the materials? Or did they just go, oh, yep, trusting AI has done it all properly, and I just want to make some bucks on this, and so off we go. I think the craziest part of this book is the lack of images, and then the images that are included. Every single image in there is an AI generated image. You can tell straight away, you know when something is photographed by the person who has done it or not. So an example is, there was one picture that had 3 hands in it. Okay. And then there was another one that it was talking about weaving some coasters. And it was really interesting, actually. It had the loom with the warp, and then it had the coaster was just kind of floating in the middle of the warp. So there were warp threads on either side that hadn't been used, but there was no mention of that in the pattern, like they were supposed to be used. And then this image of this weaving just kind of floating in the middle of the warp. Another one, there was it was showing some hem stitching, and the line, the fell of the fabric, so like the last pick that was woven, was kind of in stair steps according to where the needle was in the picture. So that was also very interesting and obviously not right. And then I saw what was supposed to be a rigid heddle loom in one of the pictures. It was the most interesting rigid heddle loom I've ever seen, because it was like a composition of 2 rigid heddle looms to show double heddle weaving. So it was like AI had kind of smacked these 2 looms together, divided them in half, and then smacked them together and smoothed it all over. And yeah, that was a really interesting loom, like I've never seen before, because it doesn't exist. My personal first encounter with AI, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, but it was just when ChatGPT was becoming a popular thing. And I was like, I want to kind of look into this. And so I went to ChatGPT and I asked it some question about weaving. I've got no idea what it was. It was like a, fairly basic rigid heddle weaving question. And what came up, the answer it came up with, kind of left me gobsmacked for a beginning, because it wrote in a way that I would write. So the answer was kind of like reading one of my own blog posts. And to start with, I was like, this is so bizarre. Like, it's written in my tone and everything. And this was the first time I had used it. What I realized was my website has over 1,000 articles on it, right? So I realized that it had basically taken the answer from my website, from, however it searches and gets all of this information together from a bunch of different articles and all of that. I realized at that point that it wasn't something that I was going to be able to do anything about. Obviously, if I'd written all of these articles and I found some weaving book that had pretty much copy and pasted my articles, then I could do something about that, because that would be plagiarism. But with AI, it's like a sweeping tide. What can you do? So I thought, okay, I'm just going to accept it. I don't have to accept it as a good thing. I don't have to accept it as a bad thing. I'm just going to accept it for what it is. It's here, it's being used, but there are ways definitely to minimize the more negative aspects of it. And that would be things like not buying AI-generated books. So that brings me to, how do you recognize what is an AI-generated book? Well, here are the things that I have found to look out for, because they're things that these books all have in common. The first and most obvious one is AI-generated images. Now, I admit I can't always tell what is AI-generated and what's a real image, because some of the images that we've seen over the past few years, they are extremely polished. They are taken by a real photographer, but then they've used all kinds of editing tools, filters, etc., to present it in a very, very polished way. And so images like that, sometimes it's difficult to tell, is this AI or is this a real image? But generally, with weaving, you can tell. Because again, these people who are putting these weaving AI books out, they're not weavers. They don't know anything about weaving. And so they don't understand when an image looks completely bizarre. And to weavers, straight away, we can go, what the heck is that? That's not a rigid heddle loom. That's not how someone looks when they're weaving. I don't have 3 hands, obvious things like that. Okay, another commonality is that most of the ones that I saw on Amazon, in fact, all of them, were published this year, and I'm talking like mid-year and onwards. Why is that? I think it's because AI is leveling up all the time. And so maybe a year ago, it made really rubbish images that were just laughable. Some of them still are, but it's gotten much better at this point. And so I think a lot of people are doing that at this time now for that reason. And also probably more people are cottoning on to the idea that I don't actually have to do any work. I can just tell ChatGPT to write a book with images and say exactly what I want in that book, and it'll do it for me. And I'll put it on Amazon and I will make money. Okay, so the next thing to look out for is reviews. This goes for the same with any product. Anytime you're going to spend money on a product, especially if you're going to spend a significant amount, which a book usually isn't, but you look at the reviews. Are there any reviews? Are the reviews positive? Are the reviews negative? One thing that these AI books all have in common, there are either no or they're very low reviews. So most of the ones I looked at had no reviews, and one I looked at had a 1-star review. So that kind of tells you what you need to know to be suspicious of the purchase. Generally, these books are very low priced. They are available in paperback and in digital versions. I bought this one as a digital version, which is why I'm not actually holding the book and showing it to you physically. And if you compare their pricing to the pricing of other weaving books that are available, there's a huge discrepancy. So this digital one I bought for 11 Australian dollars. That's pretty low for a book. I think the physical copy was about $22, maybe $22. That's really low for a weaving book. Weaving books are actually kind of expensive. So that's another indicator. So another one is strange sounding authors' names. This one actually doesn't have an author's name on it. There's another alarm bell. But there's also, one was something like Dorian Weaverstone or something like that. Like they're not just your normal names that you would expect to hear from weaving books. Another thing you can do, if they do have the name listed, they should at least have the name of the seller listed, is you can click on them. I clicked on one of them and it wasn't this guy who did this book, but it was a different one. They had a ton of craft themed books and they were obviously all exactly the same, AI generated, without the person knowing anything about the crafts that they were putting books out about. The last thing to look out for is to read the description of the book and read it through and tell me whether it feels like a natural description. In fact, read a few of them and you'll see how very, very similar they are in their descriptions. And that's because AI is generating them for the person. See, they don't do any of the work on the book. They use AI completely for everything. And that becomes pretty obvious when the descriptions are so very similar. They use the same kind of language, they use the same layout, the same characters, everything. So I would love to hear your thoughts down below. Let me know, have you been duped by one of these AI sellers? Have you bought a book or anything else informational that you thought was, you bought it in good faith, but it ended up being AI generated and pretty useless to you? And then also let me know if you've bought a book that you realized later was AI, but you actually did get some value from it. That would be an interesting thing to talk about as well. Now, I said that I had some other book recommendations for you. I've got a book list specifically for rigid heddle weavers, and that's actually in this video here. So make sure that you go and watch that one next. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and until next time, happy weaving.